This is the story of the war that dares not speak its name. A war that started over 40 years ago, but has never officially been declared.
Axis of evil.
The war between Iran on the one side and the United States and Israel on the other is both ideological and strategic, a conflict that stirs up passions, resentment, and hatred. And were it ever to escalate, the entire Middle East would be affected, very possibly triggering a new global conflict. To understand this potential return of barbaric violence, we must go back in time to unravel the tangled threads of tragedy and seek the elusive truths behind the dogmas and the certainties, and tell this story. February 27, 1991. The American army had just inflicted a bloody defeat on Iraq, following the invasion of Kuwait 6 months earlier. Although the big winner in this first Gulf War, little did Washington know that it had triggered a process in Iran that would soon shake up the entire Middle East.
Kuwait is liberated. Iraq's army is defeated. Our military objectives are met.
For President George H.W. Bush, the liberation of Kuwait was only the first stage of a much more ambitious policy. He wanted to build a new Middle East. After the victory in Iraq, he sought to make the Persian Gulf, whose oil wealth made it a particularly strategic region, more secure for American interests. But to achieve his goal, Bush first needed to resolve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, threatening the stability of the entire Middle East. The process was launched with a peace conference in Madrid. In his efforts to impose his Pax Americana on the Gulf, President Bush invited anyone with any potential influence on the Arab-Israeli conflict. Europeans, Soviets, leaders of the Maghreb and the Middle East all attended. Only one country was missing: the Islamic Republic of Iran.
The visceral answer for why Iran was not invited is the hangover from the hostage taking. It's still with us today. Hatred of Iran for the 1979 hostage taking. That is behind U.S. policy today more than anybody thinks or believes. It's a part of every moment of every thought about Iran.
At the time, consideration was given to making the conference as universal as possible, but I can't recall that any thought was given to inviting the Iranians. The United States was the sole superpower, the big Satan, and the conference was going to involve making peace with the little Satan, with Israel.
In Tehran, Iran's new leaders did not accept their country being outlawed. Since Khomeini's death in 1989, two figures in the Islamic Revolution had ruled the country. Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was the new supreme leader. A loyal follower of his predecessor, he was unbending in his refusal to compromise. Hashemi Rafsanjani was president of the republic. A wealthy businessman, he too was very close to the former supreme leader. He was a pragmatist and a realist. Both men opted for benevolent neutrality towards the Americans during the Gulf War.
The Iranians did help the United States against Saddam Hussein in that war. They opened up a channel of communication. They allowed the U.S. to use Iranian airspace. The Iranians did this as a way of quietly supporting the United States. And they thought that after the war, they would be rewarded for it, and the reward would just be inclusion.
Most importantly, the bankrupt and devastated Islamic Republic desperately needed to emerge from its isolation. Iran was still reeling from the interminable war against Iraq between 1980 and 1988, a devastating conflict that left 500,000 dead and deeply traumatized the country. The regime almost collapsed. Moving forward, as well as protecting its borders, Iran desperately needed to modernize.
Rafsanjani's priority was rebuilding, because he thought, and I think he was right, that the most important thing is rebuilding the ravaged economy. So he began normalizing relations with anyone who he could. He began talking about normalizing relations even with the United States.
That time there were two schools of thought in Iran. One was saying, don't trust Americans. They are cheating, they are lying, and they would deceive you. And the other, like Rafsanjani himself said, we are not going to lose anything. We would show our goodwill. If they don't, then everybody in this country and beyond, they would know Americans are the guilty part, not the Iranians.
For Iranian leaders, the Madrid conference was proof that the Americans were in no way seeking a thaw in relations. Would this Pax Americana, based on Arab-Israeli reconciliation, be turned against them and their interests?
I think a conclusion they may have drawn from the failure to be included in Madrid is not just that they may not be able to trust the U.S. I don't think they had much trust to begin with. I think it's a conclusion that they drew that if they're not problematic enough, they will be ignored. If they have the power to be able to show that they can create problems, then the U.S. would have to deal with them.
خیال نکنن قدرت‌های فراملیتی یا تبعشون در این منطقه که می‌شود ایران را ناامن کرد و منطقه را برای دیگران امن نگه داشت. نخیر، این خواب و خیالی بیش نیست.
Ayatollah Khamenei decided to act. 2 weeks before Madrid, he organized his own conference, dedicated to supporting Palestine. The Supreme Leader managed to bring together the representatives of some 60 movements from very diverse ideological or religious backgrounds. In attendance were revolutionaries, nationalists, and Islamists. All of them expressed a rejection of American domination in the Middle East, rejection of the occupation of Palestine, and rejection of the State of Israel. Here, behind the scenes at the conference, close links between the Lebanese Hezbollah, the Palestinian Islamist Hamas, and the Islamic Jihad began to be forged, giving rise to what Tehran would later call the axis of resistance. This axis very quickly became a target for the United States and Israel. The Shiite community in the southern suburbs of the Lebanese capital was in mourning. At least 50,000 turned out to mourn the death of their leader. Sheikh Abbas Musawi, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, a key figure at the Tehran conference, had died the previous day, along with his wife and son, killed by the Israeli army. Israel had never before eliminated such a prominent leader within the Shiite organization.
There's no question that our capacity to defend ourselves and their capacity to attack us have changed dramatically. We will be able to defend ourselves better. They will be able to hit us not as effectively because the organizing brain has been removed.
So what exactly happened? In early 1992, faced with the kidnapping of its soldiers in southern Lebanon, Israel decided to seize key members of Hezbollah to carry out a prisoner swap. Sheikh Musawi was a prime target. On February 16th, military intelligence was informed that the Shiite leader was about to drive to a village in southern Lebanon to attend a ceremony. They decided to have him followed by surveillance drones. He arrived in the early afternoon, according to plan, oblivious to the fact that his every movement was being monitored by Israeli intelligence.
We knew we had high-level information which would allow us to strike at our objective, Musawi. There was no need to wait 3 or 4 months, and I said as much to the Chief of Staff.
Rather than kidnapping Musawi, Yuri Sagi advocated eliminating him. Another opportunity was unlikely to arise for a long time, he argued. Now was the time to strike. A helicopter took off with orders to kill the Shiite leader as soon as he left the ceremony. Shortly before 4 p.m., Musawi's Mercedes was engulfed in flames. The sheikh, his wife, and son were killed instantly. The Israeli army appeared to have gained the upper hand over Hezbollah.
From an intelligence point of view, the strike was unquestionably a success. But from a strategic point of view, it was a disaster. Taking a decision like that, there are no words for it. It was basically a mess. Before his elimination, there was no discussion about whether or not we should do it, and what the consequences might be.
Everyone had agreed, but no one considered the consequences of the action. I told them, look, it may provoke a terrorist attack overseas. There may be consequences. No, 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 was the response.
A month later, on March 17, 1992, a car bomb exploded in front of the Israeli embassy in Argentina. 28 people were killed, with 250 injured. Islamic Jihad claimed responsibility for the attack. But in Israel, many saw it as a direct response from Hezbollah and Tehran to Musawi's assassination.
I can't speak for anyone else, but I had misgivings about the whole thing. Did I know what we were doing? Had I properly assessed the risk-benefit ratio, given that the elimination of Musawi led to dozens of Jews killed in Argentina? Perhaps the Shia devil had become even more fearsome. Make no mistake, they didn't want peace. But sometimes you can hasten things when you don't intend to, and they take on a dynamic you never intended.
It was decisive. It initiated something new in our relationship with Hezbollah and in our relationship with its leader, Iran. Because in actual fact, we had directly hit Iran.
Israeli intelligence then learned that the situation had potential to deteriorate even further. Not only was Iran weaponizing Hezbollah, it was planning to develop nuclear weapons. If Israel failed to react, it was no exaggeration to think that the country's very existence might be at stake. One man was determined to thwart this threat, the new Israeli Prime Minister, Yitzhak Rabin. When he came to power in June 1992, a few weeks after the attack in Argentina, he had already made Israeli history. Born in Jerusalem in 1922, Rabin was a veteran of the War of Independence in 1948. Then, as chief of the General Staff of the IDF, he oversaw Israel's victory in the Six-Day War in June 1967, which gave it control over East Jerusalem, the West Bank, Gaza, and the Golan Heights. Faced with the prospect of an Iranian nuclear bomb, Rabin chose an unconventional strategy. Israel had to reach an understanding with the Palestinians. This would make it easier for Israel to protect itself against Iran. It was an historic and enduring image. After months of secret negotiations, Rabin agreed to the Oslo Accords at the White House with the man he had always called a terrorist, PLO leader Yasser Arafat. For the first time since the creation of the State of Israel, a genuine peace process was underway between the Israelis and Palestinians.
The children of Abraham, the descendants of Isaac and Ishmael, have embarked together on a bold journey. Together, today, with all our hearts and all our souls, we bid them shalom, salam, peace.
As he shook hands with Arafat, Rabin was also thinking of Iran, the country he would be able to better protect himself from, now that peace with the Palestinians had become possible. Three weeks later, however, a bus exploded near an Israeli settlement in the West Bank. Hamas claimed responsibility. Then, an Israeli settler committed a massacre in Hebron. Further tragedies followed. Extremists from every side did their level best to thwart the peace process. It was a godsend for Tehran. It was time to get back into the game and challenge Israel's strategy.
Iran has never been in the favor of peace process, I tell you very openly, very frankly, very sincerely, because from the day one, Iran believed Israel is after cheating. And Israel is not ready to accept the rights of Palestinians. Iran was convinced from the day one, and since 100% was convinced this is a plot to kill the time and to kill the wishes and the dreams and the rights of Palestinians, Iran was not ready to accept it.
Above all, for Khamenei, the success of the Oslo Accords would have signaled the victory of a regional order dominated by the United States and Israel, one that finally solved the Palestinian question, but relegated Iran to a supporting role. So to re-establish his country as a key player, The Supreme Leader decided that the covenant sealed during the Tehran Conference of October 1991 must be translated into action. To that end, he stepped up support for the Palestinian Islamist movements, Hamas and Islamic Jihad.
Iran is responsible, with the other extreme Islamic groups, for the setup of international terror. And in addition, Iran tries to build military capability, conventional and non-conventional.
The specter of an Iran armed with weapons of mass destruction and the missiles to deliver them haunts not only Israel, but the entire Middle East, and ultimately all the rest of us as well. The United States, and I believe all the Western nations, have an overriding interest in containing the threat posed by Iran.
To prevent Iran from financing terrorism and developing nuclear weapons, Washington imposed economic sanctions, the prelude to a total embargo, with the aim of isolating the country, bringing it to its knees, and rendering it harmless. However, it would not be Tehran behind the tragedy that was soon to strike at the very heart of the United States. A tragedy with such symbolic and political significance, it would usher in a new era for the entire Middle East. It was the most audacious and deadly attack in the history of terrorism. Faced with nearly 3,000 casualties, it was clear to the United States that its real enemy was not the Shia Islamism of Iran and Hezbollah, so much as the Sunni radicalism embodied by al-Qaeda and its Saudi-born leader, Osama bin Laden. President George W. Bush, elected the previous year, had no choice but to take decisive action.
We will not only deal with those who dare attack America, we will deal with those who harbor them and feed them and house them. Make no mistake about it. Underneath our tears is the strong determination of America to win this war. And we will win it.
The president fixed the objective: to overthrow the Taliban regime in Afghanistan, which for many years had provided sanctuary, support, and funding to al-Qaeda. Secretary of State Colin Powell was tasked with preparing the ground before the offensive. Having served as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff during the First Gulf War, and as a moderate in an administration full of neoconservative hawks, he understood that his country needed to act with the help of an unexpected partner.
I was asked by Colin Powell, the Secretary of State, to take on the responsibilities initially for working with the Iranian opposition to form a successor government to the Taliban. I recognized that I needed to talk to the countries that had been supporting the Afghan opposition. I made clear that I thought I needed to talk to Iran as part of my responsibilities, and Colin Powell agreed.
The United States seeking help from Iran, its sworn enemy? But as well as sharing a nearly 1,000-kilometer-long border with Afghanistan, the Islamic Republic was the ideal ally to bring down the Taliban regime.
Taliban was an anti-Iranian, anti-Shia extremist group. It had victimized the Hazara, the Shia minority in Afghanistan.
The Iranians themselves almost went to war with Afghanistan in 1998 after the Taliban struck the Iranian consulate in Mazar-e-Sharif and killed roughly 10 Iranian diplomats and a journalist. So the Iranians have deep animosity and enmity with the Taliban.
The first American bombardments fell on Afghanistan on October 7, 2001. Operation Enduring Freedom had begun. A month later, the Northern Alliance, the main coalition opposing the Taliban, took Kabul with the help of American troops, backed and assisted by Iran. The most pressing concern now was to build a new Afghanistan. In early December 2001, an international conference chaired by Washington got underway in Bonn, Germany, bringing together all the Afghan factions. Here again, Tehran sought to play a central role, and it was Iranian delegate Mohammad Zarif who managed to obtain a compromise from the Afghan factions for the establishment of an interim government, as well as the wording of a final declaration. Iran was jubilant. 10 years on, they had avenged their ban from the Madrid conference, proving that, given the opportunity, they could play a stabilizing role on the international scene. Proving, too, that they did not deserve the sanctions weighing down their economy.
The Iranians told me they were interested in a broader dialogue. I said I wasn't authorized to talk about anything but Afghanistan, but that I would pass their interest along.
The message went nowhere. In post-9/11 America, the advantage was firmly with the neoconservatives, Vice President Dick Cheney and Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, for whom the collaboration with Iran was only a tactical and thus temporary arrangement.
Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld took over the process. Every time Iran would be a policy agenda item on the National Security Council's list, Dick Cheney would make sure it came off. So by making the system dysfunctional and by not having a discussion on Iran, there never was. The decision was by default, we don't talk to evil, which is what Dick Cheney said.
Mr. Speaker, the President of the United States.
The devil then was Iran. But it was also North Korea, and especially Saddam Hussein's Iraq.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger. The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons.
With his axis of evil speech, Bush definitively closed the door on any rapprochement with Iran. By May 1st, 2003, the first objective had been achieved. By crushing Saddam Hussein's regime, George W. Bush put an end to the campaign initiated by his father in 1991 during the first Gulf War. He basked in the victory among his troops. Nothing, it seemed, could stand in his way.
Obviously, when the United States invaded Afghanistan and then invaded Iraq under false pretenses, and after lying about weapons of mass destruction in Iraq and lying about a relationship between Saddam Hussein and Al-Qaeda, the Iranians were concerned that the United States would try to destabilize Iran or invade the country.
Three days after the American victory in Iraq, Tehran took a staggering initiative, an initiative with the potential to change everything in the Middle East. At the State Department in Washington, a fax arrived via an intermediary, Tim Guldemann, the Swiss ambassador in Tehran. He had been representing the interests of the United States in Iran since the closure of its embassy in 1979. The document seemed barely credible. It proposed talks on the links with Hamas and Islamic Jihad, the disarmament of Hezbollah and weapons of mass destruction. In return, Iran sought the lifting of sanctions, recognition of its role in the region, and access to Western technologies, in particular, civilian nuclear power. Washington pondered the implications. Why would the supreme leader, hitherto so inflexible, suddenly support such a move?
I think there were people in the Iranian system that had come to the conclusion that the small steps had not led to anything, and that the only way to break the deadlock was to do something big, comprehensive. And I've been spending a lot of time thinking about what that would be, had floated those ideas, had created some political readiness in Tehran for it.
But at the State Department, where the collaboration with Iran on Afghanistan had been established, nobody was prepared to take the document submitted by the Swiss diplomats seriously. After its exclusion from the Madrid Conference and the discourse on the axis of evil, for Tehran, this new refusal to engage in dialogue was proof that Washington was still bent on effecting regime change in Iran. So, in order to protect the Islamic Republic, Ayatollah Khamenei made a radical decision. He decided to intensify and press ahead with the uranium enrichment program, and in doing so, acquire nuclear weapons as soon as possible.
Today, I want to extend my very best wishes to all who are celebrating Nowruz around the world, and I hope that you enjoy this special time of year with friends and family.
Then, one man decided to improve relations between his country and Iran. Barely 3 months after taking office, President Barack Obama addressed Iran directly on the occasion of the Persian New Year. It was a first in the history of the two countries.
We know that you are a great civilization, and your accomplishments have earned the respect of the United States and the world.
The new president was the antithesis of his predecessor. A staunch Democrat who had been opposed to the invasion of Iraq in 2003, he believed in multilateralism and in the force of diplomacy to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. He also believed that Israel should be prevented from ever attacking Tehran. If that happened, he believed the entire Middle East would sink into chaos.
It is clear, at least from the priority that the president gave to Iran, that he did feel this was a national security issue. He did feel that Iran with a nuclear bomb was a threat to the region, perhaps to Europe, to the US.
But Benjamin Netanyahu was skeptical about Obama's military option in the event of failed negotiations. In his eyes, the American president knew nothing about the Middle East, while he himself was an experienced leader. Coming from a very conservative Zionist background and the former head of an elite commando unit, he had already led the country 10 years earlier. Netanyahu had never wavered in his refusal to compromise on Israel's security. He declared himself ready to destroy Iran's uranium enrichment facilities without Washington's consent.
Israel was prepared to act without American backing. They have never concealed their opposition to an operation like this. They regarded it as damaging. But I remember discussions with Bush and then Obama, one-to-one, and also sometimes with their security advisors. I clearly told them that when we reached a critical stage in terms of the security and future of the State of Israel and the Jewish people, we would not delegate responsibility to anyone else, not even to our closest allies. We would take our decisions in full sovereignty, according to our own considerations.
For Netanyahu and Ehud Barak, military intervention then was the only sure way to prevent Iran from acquiring the bomb. But before they took action, they needed the approval of key ministers and leading military and intelligence officials. To be legitimate, it was imperative that the historic decision to attack Iran met with a broad consensus.
I thought the military option was wrong, not because it was technically impossible, but because there was no American consensus. We didn't have its support. Even if we managed to destroy certain facilities, it would not solve the problem. It would merely dismantle the coalition established by Obama.
Outnumbered, the two Israelis were forced to back down. Obama, however, remained uneasy. If he was to get a deal with Iran before Netanyahu could convince his cabinet to follow him down the road to war, he needed to wrestle back control. At the end of 2012, in the utmost secrecy, he entered into direct negotiations with Iran. A succession of meetings, both in and out of the public eye, ensued. An agreement was on the way. Thus, on March 3, 2015, Netanyahu made one final attempt to derail the process. He went to Washington to address Congress and launched into a tirade against the policies of his most loyal ally. It was unprecedented in the history of relations between the two countries.
Ladies and gentlemen, I've come here today to tell you we don't have to bet the security of the world on the hope that Iran will change for the better. We don't have to gamble with our future and with our children's future. So this deal won't change Iran for the better. It will only change the Middle East for the worse.
But the Israeli leader's maneuver proved to be futile, and his speech changed nothing. Obama won the day. Four months later, on July 14, 2015, the nuclear agreement was signed. Tehran was represented by its Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mohammad Zarif, the man who had cooperated with the United States against the Taliban in 2001.
I believe this is a historic moment. We are reaching an agreement that is not perfect for anybody, but it is what we could accomplish, and it is an important achievement for all of us. Today could have been the end of hope on this issue, but now we are starting a new chapter of hope.
Iran pledged to limit its uranium enrichment program to the production of civilian energy and abandon its quest for nuclear weapons. In return, it would obtain the gradual lifting of the sanctions that were stifling its economy. For the vast majority of Iranians, the agreement was a beacon of hope. Their country was finally ready to join the global community. For Netanyahu, it was a disaster. Strengthened and legitimized, the Islamic Republic was now inescapable in the Middle East. Israel was more isolated than ever. But this new dynamic between Iran and the United States would prove to be short-lived.
If we do nothing, we know exactly what will happen. In just a short period of time, the world's leading state sponsor of terror, will be on the cusp of acquiring the world's most dangerous weapons. Therefore, I am announcing today that the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal.
This decision by President Trump marked the beginning of a new phase in the long history of relations between Iran on the one side and the United States and Israel on the other. Since the founding of the Islamic Republic in 1979, war has never broken out between Washington and Tehran. But nor has there been any real dialogue. The two enemies have repeatedly failed to reconcile their long-standing differences and consider each other as valid counterparts. For its part, Israel perceives Iran as an increasingly radical and deadly threat. Until the Shia theocracy recognizes the legitimacy of the Jewish state, progress will remain impossible. For over 40 years, hostility has been the norm. For over 40 years, the same deadly spiral of confrontation, intolerance, and hatred, with each side set upon destroying the other, intent upon opening one front after another, and thereby ruling out any possibility of dialogue and peace.